thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. Can you hear me like this? Okay. I'm being filmed, so I'm extra nervous. All right, applications of cognitive linguistics. Is the term cognitive linguistics familiar to any of you yet? Some are nodding. Okay. Let's start with a bit of background. What this talk is about basically is the importance of memory. Whether you like it or not, language learning relies on memory. It's a very painful business of item learning. It's system learning, but it's also item learning. It's a matter of moving from noticing things to remembering things. And when I talk about item learning, first and foremost, what I mean is vocabulary. We know from a lot of correlational studies that general proficiency is very much reliant on vocabulary size. Most studies that correlate general proficiency tests and vocabulary tests come up with correlation coefficients of up to 0.8, which is very strong. We also know that building a sizable vocabulary, and size matters here, is a very challenging task. I guess you all know Paul Nation? He's been here before? Yeah. So you may remember that according to Paul's estimates, you need knowledge of about 8,000 word families to become an independent reader of non-simplified texts. What he means is 8,000 word families. It's not just 8,000 words, but word families. A word family is the head word plus its derivations. So take argue, arguing, argued, argues, argument. Those could all arguably make up one word family. And so 8,000 of those. Quite daunting. Obviously, that's way too much to be taught in the classroom. And so we have to be hopeful that a lot of vocabulary learning will happen incidentally through extensive reading, through watching television, for example. But we also know from research by Batya Laufer, for example, that incidental acquisition is actually a very, very slow process. And so people like Batya Laufer call for more deliberate learning practices as well to complement the incidental acquisition. And that, of course, then raises the question, what kind of instructional methods can we find that make optimal use of classroom time? Because classroom time, obviously, is very limited. Okay? That's a little bit of the background. But the challenge is even greater than we used to think, because polysemy is the norm in vocabulary. Most words have more than one meaning. If you take examples like embrace, she embraced her husband, means something slightly different from she embraced sociocultural theory. Okay? And we can't take it for granted that if you understand the root meaning of a word, that students will also be able to work out the extended meanings. A lot of studies actually show that most students are not capable of doing that at all. Another example, these two types of arguments are not exactly the same, are they? I love mushrooms, but night shops mushroomed across town. Again, one and the same form, if you like, but different meanings. And if you take high-frequency words, then you get a whole range of different uses. And we can't take it for granted that if you come across something like to blow your chances, that students will actually be able to understand this because they know the meaning, for example, of blow a whistle. The challenge is greater than we used to think also because you're talking about words only, but a lot of multi-word units, formulaic sequences, if you like. That's also one of the reasons why I call this item learning rather than word learning. Multi-word units make up about half of natural discourse, according to some estimates. It's just an excerpt from the typical BBC radio program. All the items in red, to me and to people I've asked, are multi-word units. They are formulaic sequences that can't really be explained by means of grammar rules. It's just those words belong together. The ones I've underlined are of a special category, which I'll talk about later. Okay? You may wonder, well, do learners need help with these multi-word units as well? Well, obviously, yes. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here. And otherwise, I wouldn't be giving a topic on this, workshop on this topic tomorrow either. Very briefly, why do they need help with this? Well, usually the meaning of multi-word units can't be inferred from the meaning of the constituent words. Even very high-frequency words that make up multi-word units may be polysemous, and so you can't rely on learners working out the meaning. Take to put up with something. Put up with, all high-frequency words may be known by the student, but the meaning of to put up with transcends the combination. That's what we call non-compositionality. There was an article by Martinez and Murphy in TESOL Quarterly last year with very interesting examples along those lines. They show that, for example, if learners come across something like, he is over the hill, they interpret this as, his house is on the other side of the hill. Right? It's about time, they interpret as, oh, this text is about the topic of time. You may wonder whether multi-word units might not be acquired incidentally through reading, for example. But if you start counting those multi-word units, you find that they don't occur very often. And according to certain estimates, you need to encounter items at least 5 times in a relatively short span of time in order to remember them. Now, a number of years ago, I was reading on the beach. I was reading a silly crime story. I didn't like the story, so I took a pencil and started underlining multi-word units instead. I'm a bit of a freak, that's what I do. And I started counting verb-noun collocations. And in this story, 120 pages long, this is what I found. So most of those collocations occur just once. So just imagine an advanced learner reading a novel like this on a Sunday afternoon, maybe spending 5 hours on this. This is the likelihood of encountering the same multi-word item more than once. None of them occur more than 5 times. So incidental acquisition is pretty unlikely. Okay. How does cognitive linguistics come into the picture then? Well, if we accept that there's a need for vocabulary instruction, deliberate learning, then of course you have to look for interventions that are likely to be optimally efficient. It is generally agreed that interventions that stimulate cognitive engagement foster retention. So if you do something with the words that you encounter, or with the expressions that you encounter, in a cognitively enriching way, that's going to help you remember those words or expressions. And then my background is actually linguistics. My PhD many years ago was on linguistics, on lexicology, within a framework called cognitive linguistics. And I started thinking, well, maybe there is something in there that we can use to stimulate this engagement with vocabulary. What is cognitive linguistics? There's no time to really give a comprehensive account of cognitive linguistics. It started in the late 1970s as a reaction against Chomskyan linguistics. And basically what the claim is that language is not a separate module in the mind. It is a part of general cognition. And if linguistic phenomena are part of cognition in general, then maybe they are not as arbitrary as people used to think they were. Instead of arbitrary, they're thought to be motivated. So motivation here is a technical term that means not arbitrary. Once we start looking into this, it becomes clear that some things in language are more likely to happen than other things. Have a look at these. Why are these expressions rather odd? The table was being run around. Grammatically, perfectly fine, but would you say it? You wouldn't say it because it doesn't match the way we perceive the world. When we perceive the world, we tend to attend to the things that are salient in our field of perception, and those salient things are usually moving objects. In this case, the children maybe who are running around the table, but not the kind of background. Okay? And it's the salient things that are typically given the role of agent, subject in a sentence. Okay. How about this one? She's not his real stepmother. That doesn't match our prototype categorization. The prototypical mother is a biological mother. And if you, that's the default. You would only modify if you move away from the prototype, right? It's a bit like walking to a bar and ordering a glass of alcohol-containing wine, please. Shall I give you a foot with that? Makes little sense, because we know from our real-world experience that if you manipulate things, you tend to use your hands, right? So it's, shall I give you a hand with that, not your foot. All that good news is really getting me down. Doesn't match our metaphorical structure of good things are up, happy is up, unhappy is down. And that's probably because if you are happy, you tend to be up and about. You smile a lot, corners of your mouth go up, and so we associate happiness with up. And if you're sad, you tend to stoop. Okay? And so if you look at language as a reflection of general cognition, then you can try to explain things like polysemy. So one of the hobby horses of cognitive linguists used to be prepositions, because prepositions are really almost the ultimate case of polysemy. If you take something like beyond, in physical space, you can say the ball landed beyond the hedge, which means it was beyond your reach. So very often, if you use beyond, it means that something becomes inaccessible. Metaphorically, you can then map this onto abstract inaccessibility, and you get expressions like, why she got married to him is beyond me. Okay? So it is a chaining of different meanings. If you look at the use of metaphor, which cognitive linguists have studied quite intensively, you notice that a lot of conventional expressions instantiate the same umbrella metaphor. So things like students digesting information, swallowing nonsense, having a great thirst for knowledge, spicing up your classes, that all reflects one and the same metaphor. Learning is some kind of intake, eating and drinking. That's just one of many metaphors we have for learning and teaching. Okay. And so what a first generation of applied cognitive linguists tried to do in the 1990s especially was to stimulate engagement on the part of learners with words and expressions by resuscitating those connections between root meanings and extended meanings. And so they looked at the possibility of, well, if students encounter a word that's used in a figurative sense, then would it help if the students were made aware of the root or the original meaning of the words? So if you take, for example, the expression on the right, these students just regurgitate what they've been taught. Regurgitate, of course, physically means something different. To weed out is from gardening. To forge a new alliance, well, you can also, if you're a blacksmith, forge a sword. And what studies show is that if you do this, if you make students aware of the original meaning of those words, they remember these much better. Okay? Because it encourages engagement. Other proposals use those general metaphors and have tried to cluster expressions together that reflect the same conceptual metaphor. When we talk about anger, we very often use expressions to do with heat. And that's because if you are really feeling angry, you get red in the face, your body temperature rises, and so you get an association with anger is heat. And so English is full of expressions that have this idea of you have the container of the body, emotions are substances inside the body, anger, when you get angry, is heated up, and you may actually erupt like a volcano. This is actually the image that Freud used for his psychoanalysis. You need to ventilate once in a while, otherwise you'll blow up. We describe angry people as if they were dangerous animals, because angry people tend to be dangerous. Interestingly, so although these are metaphors that are quasi-universal, the linguistic expression of the metaphors, of course, varies across different languages. If you take the expression, don't bite my head off, in Dutch I would say, don't bite my nose off, for example. And so, in the days when I used to teach EFL to Dutch speakers, they would indeed sometimes be misled by their L1, and they would say in English, don't bite my nose off. But anyway. So it's not just the conceptual metaphor, we need to focus on the form as well, but I'll talk about that later. Phrasal verbs, one of those hurdles in English learning. Again, you can use the same kind of logic. More is up, less is down, is reflecting lots of phrasal verbs. And the metaphor itself is motivated because if you add things to a pile, it goes up, right? Active is up as well, because if you're active, of course you are up. And so you can say things like, the car broke down. And good is up. That's why we say cheer up. Okay, so things like phrasal verbs can be given some kind of sense of systematicity through the use of those metaphors. Those were the ideas used by cognitive linguists. You can also cluster expressions according to their source domain. The English repertoire of idioms, for example, is full of expressions that are related to sailing and ships. We know that. And that's not a coincidence, given the history of England. Okay. According to my own counts, because I sometimes read dictionaries, at least over 70 English idioms can be straightforwardly related to seafaring. We could also ask students to do this themselves. Like, what would be the domain of origin of the expressions on your left-hand side? Boxing, obviously. How about the idioms on the right-hand side? Yeah, acting and theater, okay. So, classroom experiments suggest that if you have students do this kind of task, they engage with the vocabulary and they tend to remember those expressions much better. And why would we expect this to work? Well, there's several theories that support this. There's levels of processing theory. That's Craig and Toving and Lockhart, dating back to the 70s. And they say, and also show in lots of experiments, that elaboration, especially semantic elaboration, fosters retention. Elaboration means you just do things with words. And then there's Alan Paivio's dual coding theory, which suggests that if you associate words with pictures, mental pictures, then those mental pictures will help you retrieve the words. Well-known theories. I only recently discovered that Alan Paivio was a bodybuilder. Did you know that? Canadian champion. I didn't know that. You can use mental pictures, but you can also, of course, stimulate dual coding by using real pictures as well. Okay. And notice that in cognitive linguistics applications, the pictures relate to the source domain, the origin, not the context in which the idioms are used. Okay. Now, recent studies suggest that you have to be careful with pictures as well because they distract. In recent research I've done on marginal glosses containing pictures, the result is that the students remember the pictures, not the words. So be careful about that. Another note is not all pictures work equally well. I've got a couple of examples which I took from existing textbooks for you to evaluate. This was taken from a textbook. I won't say who the author was, for diplomacy's sake. And it's supposed to elucidate the meaning of a certain idiom. Can you guess what idiom it might be? It's supposed to elucidate the meaning of to look down your nose at someone. It is, for native speakers, it is a multimodal pun. For learners, it is absolutely unhelpful. How about this one? Also from an existing textbook. To fly off the handle. Yeah. Does it elucidate the meaning of fly off the handle? Not at all. I mean, the origin of fly off the handle, so fly off the handle means to get angry all of a sudden, right? The origin is you take, for example, an axe, and you have a handle and a metal thing, and the metal thing flies off the handle. So it's dangerous. This doesn't look so dangerous, does it? Okay. Anyway. Now you don't, so to stimulate that dual coding, you can do lots of things as a teacher. You can also use miming enactment, like, can you do the exercise? Yes. It's sometimes necessary to make a snap decision. The PM, yeah, the Republicans try to, she's trying to, yeah, this is dangerous. And accepting this new job was a, yeah, all right. Students tend to remember when you act like a clown, so it helps. Okay, The really important question, of course, is, should you believe me? Does this really work? And there's some good news, because there's a series of effect of instruction studies in which cognitive linguistic style treatment was compared to other kinds of treatment. And I was asked to write a review article on this a couple of years ago. And these are the studies I found, quite a few. And if you look at the right-hand column, does CL work better? In the majority of the cases, it does work better than the comparison treatment. There's not a single study I found in which a comparison treatment actually worked better than the CL treatment. Okay. It's rather good news. Now, some things need to be acknowledged as well. In some of the studies, especially the early studies, there were no real good pre-tests. So there go some of my own studies. Okay, let's grab them. Should also be acknowledged that in some of the studies, there was a time on task issue. So the cognitive linguistics treatment got more than the other treatments. All right. I've very diplomatically always put the icon on the names so you can't see them. Also, there were tests taking effect sometimes. I'm not going to go into detail, but if you have two kinds of tests and the second test depends on your score on the first test, then of course your second test is going to blow up the difference between two groups. So there we go. Also to be acknowledged is that although there was often a significant difference between the scores of the CL treatment and the comparison treatment, learning was sometimes very small in both groups. Okay? And so you may wonder, is it worth the effort in the first place? In some cases, significance was reached because the comparison group did so badly. In some cases, the comparison group regressed as a result of teaching. Okay. Right. But on the other hand, look, collectively, it's a sign, right? As a collection, this seems to stand up. But of course, what this means is we need more and better studies. We need replication studies. So if you know of any good PhD candidates to replicate my work, for example, and to question everything that I've done, please send them to me. Now, we also have studies in which we didn't have a comparison group, but in which we just try and measure learning gains. And here's an example of something I did with colleagues years ago, back in Brussels. We created a battery of exercises targeting idioms meant for autonomous learning, online learning. And so the system was, the first students or the learners got a question like this: what domain does the following idiom come from? Any ideas? Yep, okay. So they get information. This is about athletics, indeed. When I was an EFL learner, I got this completely wrong. I thought jump the gun meant an act of bravery, because I had pictured someone holding you at gunpoint, and you jump the gun. Yeah? Wrong. The next stage is students get a question. So now that you know where it comes from, what do you think the meaning is? Multiple choice. If you know what the origin is, then this is very easy, right? They can't get it wrong. So it is, of course, to do something before the appropriate time. Okay? And suddenly the idiom makes sense to them, and they feel so good about themselves. And then the next stage is some kind of consolidation, some kind of post-test, in which they get the context and they fill in the keyword. Okay. So this is something we created years ago and unleashed this on many generations of students. And what we usually did was present students with 30 idioms at a time. So 30 idioms, the question origin, where do you think it comes from? The same 30 idioms, what does it mean? Then the same 30 idioms, gap fill exercise. This is pedagogically crazy. It is too many in one go. But for research purposes, of course, we wanted to avoid ceiling effects. Okay. At some point at the conference, and this happened time and time again, people asked, okay, but your post-test scores are straight after the treatment. I mean, what is the long-term effect of this? And so we decided to actually track down students after 2 years, and we presented them with this very delayed post-test. We gave them the gap fill exercise again, just a gap fill exercise, and they scored 85% correct on 120 idioms, which we thought was quite good. We then also quizzed them about the origin of the idioms, and we found a correlation of 0.8. So if they remembered the origin, they remembered the idiom, which seems to be indirect evidence of this dual coding association thing. Okay? Now, I sometimes teach a course on this in my MA degree, and last year I had a discussion, I could also call it an argument with a student. The student, his real name was Stephen, but I'll call him Bill for anonymous's sake. My university is very strict on confidentiality and so on. So Stephen or Bill, he said, well, Frank, maybe you can just read this. I don't have to read this aloud, do I? So this is, I transcribed the dialogue so I can. I thought, well, I'll throw in an authority figure here. Remember my crime novel? Many more idioms than collocations. And the funny thing is, when you go to conferences nowadays, there are lots of papers on collocations, and no one questions the need to target collocations. But when you talk about idioms, it's, oh, that's the icing of the cake. Yeah? And I think he's right. I mean, the use of idioms is so tricky. It is very tricky because of all those pragmatic things that go on, evaluative stance and so on. So it is very tricky. And so I actually agreed. Yeah? Unfortunately, Bill, Stephen, he was very clever, and he had actually read my work. And all my post-tests, well, not all of them, but many of them, productive knowledge. Fill in the blank and so on, right? So I had to throw in the towel. So he was right. Anyway. So the point that Bill was trying to make is, okay, idioms, fine, but what else can cognitive linguistics do then? So it's high time to broaden the scope. And so summing up what we talked about before, so this first generation of proposals is all about meaning links, polysemy, origins of idioms, linking meaning to meaning. And so the targets were polysemes and figurative phrases, and the type of elaboration is semantic. You do things with the meaning of the words. Now we know from transfer appropriate processing models nowadays that what you remember and how you remember will depend on how you've learned. So if you've learned only through semantic elaboration, you may remember meaning well, but you may not remember the form of the words very well. That's Joe Barcroft's hobby horse. So a new generation of cognitive linguists, and I've jumped a generation myself, we try to explore motivation at the level of form links and form meaning links, and I'll try to illustrate what that is all about. Why do we say in English, time will tell, while we might as well express the same thing by saying time will show, or time will reveal, or time will say? Why do we say in English, it takes two to tango, while you could just express the same meaning while it takes two to waltz or to jive? Obviously, alliteration, right? It's alliteration. English is full of alliteration. English multi-word units alliterate very often. It's typical of Germanic languages, I believe, but English is a champion. We've done the counting, you know. We count idioms and collocations in dictionaries, and we see how many of them alliterate, and then we compare across languages. That's how we keep busy in the office. And in English, about 20% of the idiom repertoire alliterates. 20%. And it's not just idioms, and that's where we are expanding the scope of application of cognitive linguistics. All kinds of multi-word units, formulaic sequences in English, show this inclination towards alliteration. Words of a feather flock together nowadays. And so I thought, well, I have to back this up with statistical evidence. So I took the English dictionary, Macmillan's dictionary, and I just read through it, and I counted all the multi-word units and whether they alliterated or not. So if you take the B section of the dictionary and you look at the multi-word entries, you can compare how often a B word is followed by another B word or by another word. And then you can compare with the D section and see if there's any trend, any difference. And what we find is indeed very strong trends towards forming multi-word units that alliterate. Okay. And I've done this all through the dictionary. And if you do this all through a dictionary, this is very systematic. Every count we did yields statistical significance. Okay? So in English, it seems that it's not opposites attract. In phraseology, it is sameness attracts. But if you don't believe me, of course, there's J.K. Rowling as well. Okay. It's tradition in English culture, English language. Okay. And then if you look at other kinds of phonological repetition, you can also look at assonance. And I use assonance to refer to rhyme as well as near rhyme. Okay. And then we find that this phonological repetition thing is especially common in short phrases, like binomial phrases, and binomial phrases A and B form of phrases. Here's just a couple of examples. Okay. Very often in these binomials, the second word doesn't really matter. It's redundant. Binomial phrases facilitate fluency. They just make you fluent. You might as well express the same thing with one word. And so what happens is alliteration or assonance, and they probably make the expressions easier to pronounce as well, and they probably have some kind of memorability. Do they have a potential memorability? Well, of course they have. In studies that I conducted in collaboration with a good friend of mine, Seth Lindstromberg, time and again, we find that if you compare uptake of alliterative collocations and non-alliterative collocations, the alliterative ones stick. Okay. There's one condition, though. The students need to be made aware of it. If they're not made aware of it, there's no difference. So there's a role of teachers and materials writers here. Okay. So we used to believe that those sound patterns had some kind of intrinsic memorability, but for learners, this intrinsic memorability needs to be unlocked. If you don't draw their attention to it, we find no difference. Okay. So teachers and materials writers can do quite a lot here. Okay. So this is a bit of the morality so far. Do you know the work of Michael Lewis, the lexical approach? Michael Lewis is actually the teacher that I crossed out. He writes in his books, don't even think about trying to explain to students why language is the way it is. All you can say is that's just the way it is. Cognitive linguistics says, please look for rhyme and reason, because if you look for rhyme and reason, you will encourage elaboration, engagement, and that will help remember. Okay. And even things like the do and make distinction. Such a problem for language learners. Very often, it's alliteration. You do a degree, but you make a move. Okay. How about that other kind of connection, the real connection between form and meaning? If I pronounced the Dutch word fluweel to you, what do you think it means? Does it mean a soft or a rough kind of fabric? Fluweel. I think you would all say soft, because it sounds so soft. Okay. Now, who do you think is the most voluptuous of the two ladies? Nikki or Barbara? Do you know of those experiments with those nonsense words, Kiki and Booba? So, psycholinguists present people with two drawings. One is a very round kind of shape, and one is a very angular kind of shape. And they ask people which of these two is the Kiki and which is the Booba. And they all go for Booba is the rounded shape. And so, yeah. So the same thing happens with Nikki and Barbara. So when you give a name to your child, think twice. And then what we call phonesthemes. Swap, sway, sweep, swing, swipe, swirl, swish, swivel, swoop, all have sw. And this sw seems to have meaning. And so there's probably something in language development that uses analogy. And if certain words with a certain meaning start in sw, then other words that have a similar kind of meaning and that get coined will also have sw. Okay. And even if you look at grammar, if you make a tentative request in English, you tend to create a distance between the agent, you, and your proposition. And you also put things in the past, because now is here, then was there. So this is iconicity. So grammar is also sometimes a matter of the form-meaning fit, which is motivated. It's not arbitrary. Okay. It is exploitable for learning. Well, yes, a PhD student of mine, Julie de Koning, set up this very strange experiment. She looked for very rare words. She didn't want to use pseudo words because she had an ethical problem with that. So she took rare words. To me, that was equally useless for the students, but anyway. So, so students didn't know the meaning of those words. One of those words means a palace. Can you guess which word means palace? Maybe not. The Seraglio is a palace. Yeah. One of those words means idiot. Can you guess? The foppity, yeah, okay. Right. Now, anyway, the students were given the meanings of those words, and they were split up into three groups. And they had to indicate on a Likert scale to what extent those three statements applied. One group was just asked, indicate how well you know this word. They were also given words they did know, otherwise they would have gone mad. Another group was asked, well, indicate how useful you find this word, because we are creating a new dictionary for advanced learners. And then the group we were really interested in was, well, how well do you think the meaning of this word fits its form? Okay. And in all our post-tests, actually the third condition did best. So just kind of thinking about, contemplating the possibility that the form of a word might actually fit its meaning, just that considering that possibility is enough to create retention. Okay, okay. Let's be clear about something. These are effective instruction studies. That's research. There are no models for classroom practice. Okay? Because what we do in these studies is present lots of new items in one go, because we avoid ceiling effects. That's not the way to go about it in the classroom, of course. Because if you do it in the classroom like that, you create lots of interference between the different words. You make learning harder. So it is probably more pedagogically sound to distribute this learning over time, but you can apply all those tricks as the opportunity presents itself. So if you have, say, a text, and students encounter in that text about, China was a fledgling democracy, and they ask, what does fledgling mean? Well, you can, of course, explain the abstract meaning, but you can also elaborate and say, well, do you know what a fledgling bird is? A young bird trying to fly, okay? Students come across, the banks were raking in a lot of profits. Well, what do? You mime raking, right? The dual coding thing. In the wake of the crisis, you draw something on the blackboard that represents the original meaning, etc. Okay. So the examples in black illustrate the meaning-meaning connection approach. Then in red, you get the phonological repetition approach, the form-form thing. Yeah? And then finally, the examples in blue are the iconicity examples. You can use those tricks just as the opportunity presents itself. So, motivated features of language can be exploited to stimulate retention of at least some vocabulary. Okay. And you have meaning-meaning, form-form, form-meaning engagement. And I agree, these are small additions, but they are welcome additions to your bag of tricks. And I'm sure a lot of you already do these things. But as I've said, I mean, we need more and better studies as well, especially longitudinal ones. Not one-off kind of experiments, but longitudinal ones. And there are some limitations, of course. Not all vocabulary is motivated. And the knowledge that you engender is kind of explicit knowledge. It doesn't stimulate or facilitate fluency. Okay? And of course, this is the bigger picture. Remember Paul Nation? Paul has this model of 4 strands. Learners should get opportunities for learning via meaning-focused input, like extensive reading and listening. Meaning-focused output, they should be able to get opportunities to use the language. Fluency development, and also language-focused learning, language-focused instruction. And that's, of course, the niche that I've been talking about. It's only that kind of part that I've been talking about. So I'm not saying, please throw out everything else and do just cognitive linguistics. It is just this little niche here, okay?